Hi, I'm Ralph.
And I'm Dr. Jen.
And this is Awesome Astronomy on YouTube. And in this show, we're going to answer the question, did we actually go to the moon? And if you're only here to grab the answer and go, the simple answer is yes.
12 men, and we say men for they were all men, have landed and explored the moon on 6 successful NASA missions between 1969 and 1972.
But if you're here for nostalgia, to learn more, or were surprised by that answer, this is a topic that I absolutely love, so we've got a lot more about this in this show. But first, we do need your help. If you like our videos, please click the subscribe button and post your thoughts and comments below so that we can see what you think about this. So 3 years in the late 1960s and early 70s, and sadly no one has returned to the moon since 1972. And that throws up a lot of questions. Why did we go? How did we manage to get there? Who went? Why were they all men? Why do some people say it's a hoax? Why haven't we been back? Will we ever go to the moon again? And all but the last of those questions is pretty much bound up in the fact that it happened between 1969 and 1972. That's a period that's closer to World War II than we are from the release of the Spice Girls' first single. So in many ways, humanity had no right to be able to go to the moon in 1969.
Technologically, the computers, electronics and materials science of the time were far too primitive.
So why did we go to the moon? Well, Russia launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. America realised it had to catch up with and surpass the Soviet Union in space in order to show what it could do technologically and to reinforce the view to its own people and people around the world that capitalism was a better system than communism. And that freed up a ton of cash to develop the technologies needed to land on the moon. Because at that time, America, and therefore Western ideology, was suffering defeat after defeat in the new space domain. Because spaceflight is hard, and you're essentially trying to harness a bomb in order to focus its explosive power in one direction to propel you in the other direction. And in the early days, while we didn't get to see Russia's failures, America's played out for all to see. And before Alan Shepard became the first American in space in May 1961, the Soviet Union had already achieved the first ever satellite launch, the first animal in space, Laika, the stray dog from the streets of Moscow, the first lander on the moon, the first pictures from the far side of the moon, and the first human in space when Yuri Gagarin flew an orbit of the Earth in April 1961.
Shepard's flight 1 month after Gagarin was already somewhat of an anticlimax and a disappointment to national prestige, as it wasn't even designed to be an orbital flight, though he did still get ticker-tape parades and a medal ceremony at the White House.
So next we ask, how did we manage to get to the moon? Luckily, the head of Germany's advanced rocket program, Werner von Braun, and much of his team of Nazi rocket engineers had transferred to the US after the Second World War and developed a succession of military rockets culminating in the mighty civilian Saturn V moon rocket for NASA. The company Raytheon and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology built the computers and developed the software for the most advanced miniaturized system ever known. New and recently developed polyimide films, thermoplastic polymer resins and silica fiber cloths were brought together to develop the Apollo spacesuit to protect the wearer from extreme temperatures, radiation and micrometeorites in space and on the moon. All this effort required a national workforce of over 400,000 people, including around 20,000 companies and universities, to work on calculating the trajectories for orbits, lunar transfers and landing, building flight simulators so the astronauts could practice operating new spacecraft while they were still being built, advancing lunar geology, manufacturing new fabrics, not to mention conceiving, designing and building the rockets, the rocket engines, the command modules, and lunar rovers that we've all seen in museums or documentaries. And it all seems so obvious now, looking back, that once the US decided to go to the moon, that it would happen. But if you were living back then, nothing about this was certain at all.
In May 1961, when President Kennedy told Congress of his commitment to advanced technologies to land a man on the moon by the end of this decade, 58% of the public were opposed to this course of action. But $250 billion in today's money was pumped into the Apollo moon program. And that led to the placing of humanity's first ever footsteps on the surface of the moon by Neil Armstrong in the Sea of Tranquility on the 20th of July 1969. And we've all heard of Neil Armstrong as the first man to walk on the moon, and most people probably know that Buzz Aldrin also joined him down on the moon, while Michael Collins orbited above their heads in the Apollo capsule.
But who else has walked on the moon? Well, actually, there were 6 more attempts over the next 3 years. Apollo 12 followed Buzz and Neil 4 months later, with Pete Conrad and Alan Bean perfecting precision landing near a lunar probe that NASA had sent in 1967. They collected samples of it to show how much things degrade on the moon, as well as valuable moon rocks. Apollo 13 launched 5 months later in 1970 with Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert famously limping the damaged spacecraft back to Earth after an explosion that meant they had to abort the moon landing. For Apollo 14, the first American in space, Alan Shepard, returned to flight to take Ed Mitchell on a golfing trip in the lunar highlands. By Apollo 15 in July 1971, NASA was getting more ambitious and gave Dave Scott and Jim Irwin a lunar rover to help them cover more ground to explore. Dave Scott also did a neat experiment with a hammer and a falcon feather in honour of the lunar module, nicknamed Falcon.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather, in my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the 2 of them here and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? Which proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
In April 1972, John Young became the first man to visit the moon twice, having flown around the moon in a rehearsal for Neil and Buzz. On the Apollo 16 mission, Young and Charlie Duke spent almost 3 days on the lunar surface and really opened up the lunar rover. Then finally in December 1972, a scientist astronaut got to explore the moon when Harrison Schmitt joined Commander Gene Cernan for the last ever voyage to the moon. After more than 3 days on the moon collecting 110 kilos of lunar samples, Cernan left the last ever human footprint on the moon. Only 4 men are still alive that can relive their memories of walking on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, Dave Scott, Charlie Duke and Harrison Schmitt. Very soon, maybe even by the time you're watching this, all those memories will be extinguished. We interviewed 4 Apollo astronauts for our Awesome Astronomy podcast. Al Bean, who walked on the moon on Apollo 12, Charlie Duke, who walked on the moon on Apollo 16, Al Warden, who orbited the moon alone for 3 days on Apollo 15, and Jack Lousmer, who was support crew for Apollos 9, 10 and 13 and first flew on the Skylab 3 space station with Al Bean. And I can honestly say that speaking with them was one of the greatest honours of my life, and they're all perfect gentlemen with incredible stories to tell. You can find the links to those interviews in the show notes below. So why were they all men? Well, because the recruitments for the classes of astronauts to go to the moon were in the 1950s and 60s, when the world was very different to today. Wally Funk, who flew on Jeff Bezos' first Blue Origin flight to space, was part of a non-NASA affiliated program, later named the Mercury 13, that put women aviators through most of the same tests that the male Mercury 7 astronauts underwent. Many of them passed all the tests, Jerry Cobb came in the top 2% of all astronaut candidates of both genders. But this was a private medical program to know how women would fare taking the same tests, not an actual NASA recruitment. In fact, NASA wouldn't recruit women. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space in 1963 for the Soviets, used this to ridicule America's inequality. In fact, while the Soviet Union was undoubtedly only allowing women to ride rockets to promote the myth of Soviet equality, Hillary Clinton tells a story of how she wrote a letter to NASA telling them that she dreamt of becoming an astronaut around 1960, only to be told, "Sorry little girl, we don't accept women into the space program." It wasn't until 1963 that Sally Ride became the first female astronaut, and she remembers the engineers trying to decide how many tampons should fly on a one-week flight. They asked, "Is 100 the right number?" Since then, around 50 American women have flown in space, but there's still been 6 times more men.
The good news, though, is that is changing. A third of the current NASA astronaut corps are now female, and the current Artemis program will land the first female and the first person of colour on the moon.
So, given all of this, why do some people say the moon landings are a hoax? And I guess it's just one of a number of ideas that gained popularity despite the evidence not supporting it. Aliens living among us, the Illuminati running the world, tracking devices in vaccines. They all require you to look for things that don't seem plausible, but then ignore the rational explanation. They actually require you to remain in ignorance while claiming to be the ones who have the veil lifted.
But in the case of the moon landing conspiracy theory, there's also the added dimension that it was so long ago when the footage was so poor. And as we outlined earlier, most of the technology that was invented in that decade to get people to the moon was too fantastical. It looks like the flag's waving in a breeze, but no. It has poles to make the flag proud, and the waving is just it being manhandled as they try to get it into the ground.
A flag would still move if it was being forced around on a pole by people handling it. And then it all stopped too abruptly. America stopped going to the moon because they'd won the space race, and Congress pulled the plug on such high levels of spending. Apollo 18, Apollo 19 and Apollo 20 were all cancelled. President Nixon had even considered cancelling Apollo 16 and 17. As NASA moved on to the development of the shuttle, the Apollo Applications Program was devised to make best and most efficient use of the leftover hardware that had been built for getting astronauts to the moon on the cancelled missions. This involved using a Saturn V booster as an orbiting space station and docking an Apollo capsule with a Soviet Soyuz capsule as a symbol of de-escalation of tensions between the two superpowers. There are a number of anomalies that moon hoax proponents point to: flags waving, shadows that aren't parallel, rocks with marks on them that make them look like they're in a sound studio somewhere. None of them hold up to scrutiny. I personally only got fascinated by the Apollo program back in 2006 when I read Moondust by Andrew Smith. If the evidence pointed towards it never happening, I would have been swayed in that direction. Skepticism isn't about denying any conspiracy theory, it's about following the evidence and logic. Since 2006, I've devoured as many books as I can from astronauts, workers, engineers, and academics involved in the Apollo moon effort. Despite the incredible detail they all gave in their individual roles in getting people to the moon, not one of them has inconsistencies where their stories overlap, and the vast majority of them have never met one another. When Nixon couldn't keep his Watergate burglary secret, and Volkswagen couldn't stop its emissions scandal from coming to light, a conspiracy theory of over 400,000 people keeping a secret over 50 years just isn't remotely feasible.
In fact, when NASA sent its lunar reconnaissance orbiter to map the moon in 2009, the cameras were so good by then that they could pick out the landing sites, footsteps, and tyre tracks from the Apollo missions.
But why trust NASA? Surely they're right at the head of the conspiracy. Well, Russian prestige and considerable money were at stake by losing the space race, and they tracked NASA missions with radar every step of the way. In fact, they had a satellite orbiting the moon called Lunar 15 when Neil and Buzz landed there. Less than a year after their landing, Armstrong went to Russia and presented them with a moon rock. Rather than claiming it hadn't happened, the chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers said he would always cherish this gift as a symbol of a great achievement.
Over on this side of the world, the Jodrell Bank radio telescope independently tracked every Apollo and Soviet mission to the Moon. This image charts the signals received by the radio telescope of Armstrong's lunar descent. The highlighted squiggle is when Armstrong took over the automated controls to avoid a boulder field.
So why haven't we been back to the Moon? And there's a number of answers to this. Nixon approved the shuttle program as a way to get a large amount of military and commercial hardware into space. A reusable spaceplane appealed to everybody and allowed us to launch things like the incredible Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station. But it meant no more money for trips to the Moon. The space race was won and the Moon was too expensive and too risky to continue funding. In a cruel irony, the Apollo program killed 3 astronauts in a test on the ground, while the shuttle program killed 7 people in each of their 2 catastrophic missions, Challenger and Columbia in 1986 and 2003. So, will we ever go to the Moon again? Well, Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump and Biden have all made this NASA's priority for human exploration. The funds have never really been sufficient to get the job done, but under NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, the last 5 years has seen a Herculean effort to get the Bush-Obama rockets and capsule finished and commission a commercial lunar lander from SpaceX. This new moon plan is named Artemis, the sister of Apollo, and aims to get people back to the Moon in 2024, although a year or 2 later seems a bit more likely to me. Only this time, the plan is to stay, build a permanent moon base for a permanent presence on the Moon, and use it as a staging post for human exploration beyond the Moon. So yes, we did go, and it looks like we're going back to stay. And with commercial players like SpaceX and Blue Origin bringing down the cost of access to space, that may mean people living today may be able to take a trip around or to the surface of the Moon. Exciting times.
And if you liked that video, Awesome Astronomy is also available twice a month in podcast form. Check out the episodes using the links below.
Please do help us out by hitting the subscribe button and liking the show.